Hello, so welcome to another of our bite-sized videos looking at the energy white paper. We're looking at this in the company of experts and key stakeholders. Today, our expert is Dr. Tim Stone, who needs no introduction in nuclear circles. He is the chairman of the Nuclear Industry Association and also chairman of the Nuclear Risk Insurers. He is also a non-executive director of the Arup Group board and previously, and this is where I knew him, as the non-executive director of Horizon Nuclear Power. Tim, thanks very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat to us about the energy white paper.
Very happy, delighted for the opportunity. Thank you.
Great. So the first question I really wanted to ask you, if I may, is how important do you think new build nuclear is to getting Britain to its net zero targets?
I will summarise that by saying no nuclear, no net zero. Simple as that. But I want to put a bit of context there. And some of you will know that my background includes 7 years working in Whitehall. But when I was there, I didn't just do nuclear. I spent quite a lot of time trying to help ensure that we got sensible financing into early stage renewables, did a lot of work on CCS, did some work to try and support tidal and so on. And I'm still doing nuclear because it's the really hard one, the really hard one. I think the context that people need to remember is that there is not a single watt of energy that's being generated today that we use that will still be around in 2050, with the possible exception of the power from Sizewell B. Everything else has yet to be built, every single thing. And the scale of this, 17% of our energy is electricity, the rest is fossil. The electricity sector is only half decarbonised anyway, but all the renewables have got less than 25 years remaining useful life too. The nukes get switched off. So we have the mother of all challenges to rebuild all the sources of our primary energy as low carbon energy. And at that point, there is no silver bullet. We don't have time for any sort of Darwinistic type evolutionary, let's try and work out what the best solution could possibly be. Frankly, guys, it's roll your sleeves up and get cracking with anything that you know that works. And in that context, it's already crystal clear that nuclear, sensibly financed, can be at least as cheap as renewables, at least as cheap. It's not to say it's going to displace them, but it has to be part of a sensible, balanced mix. And that's where we are missing a proper conversation about a systems approach to the answer.
Yeah. So Britain has taken a market-driven approach to its energy infrastructure. Do you think that is the way to get new nuclear build done?
Markets are really important where they work. And they work very well in supply chains. They work very well in relative commodities. They work in cases where the barriers to entry and exit are easy. But there's an L in PLC for a reason. There are limits to markets. And as you and one or two others know perfectly well, I used to chair the Risk and Audit Committee for Horizon. And a couple of years ago, signing some accounts in which we wrote off £2 billion is something that I never in my wildest dream I'd ever do. Nor did I ever imagine that the shareholders at the time would be whooping for joy with their share price going up by 8.5%. So there are absolutely limits to markets. I've got no doubt whatever that nuclear new build can be delivered by markets, but only once we've proven we can do it in the UK sensibly. And it's like anything else. You don't build Crossrail in the private sector. If you want to do 2 Crossrails, you might have a chance, but the first one doesn't get done in the private sector. The state has an irreducible obligation to ensure that nationally significant infrastructure is built, is maintained, and is operated, and is decommissioned. Not that we want the state to do it, but they have to make sure it jolly well happens. And with nuclear, we have stopped building nuclear in the UK after a relatively successful period with the AGRs, and we've forgotten how to do it. And we have to rediscover our chops in doing this. And I'm as certain as I'm sitting here that with a proper process of build one, build the next one, build the next one, you get to a point where the risk is perfectly understandable, manageable in the private sector, and the financing will be there. But for the first one, it is deeply scary because we haven't done it before. And it applies to SMRs, AMRs, big ones. But for each of them, they are perfectly deliverable ultimately in the private sector with a sensible approach. Actually, I'd just add to that this point that I made earlier, that with a sensible cost of capital, you end up with an electricity price which is comparable, if not cheaper, than renewables. And there's an important point here. Hinkley was financed, basically project financed. And project financing works a treat where you get a trade-off, where in return for a high cost of capital, other things are brought to bear. So some of you will know about PFI and P3 deals. In those deals, there is a trade-off where higher cost of capital comes with skills to manage risk. There is no trade-off in big energy like this. These are sovereign risk challenges. And so the only thing you should rationally do is to drive the cost of capital as low as you possibly can to ensure that we are, from an energy point of view, as internationally competitive as we possibly can be. So markets fine in the right places, but there are limits to markets. And one of the problems we have is that the whole of the administration in the UK has been built around the idea that markets solve everything, because for the last 30 years, the pace and scale of change has been small enough that markets could do things, but not at the pace and scale of change. You haven't got a prayer. You haven't got a prayer of a Darwinistic type, evolutionary, let's see what happens. And I'd even actually ask the question in energy, what does market actually mean? Because conventionally, a market is a really good way of finding out how newer technologies, newer approaches, newer management techniques can deliver cheaper outcomes. But it's an evolutionary process. You don't have time now. Our challenge now is gigawatts a year under a price cap, not can we find another way of knocking another tuppence off it. It doesn't matter. You don't have time for that. You've got to drive it through. And if we don't drive it really hard, you can kiss goodbye to net zero. It's that stark a challenge.
I read an article by you recently, which made a very interesting point, I thought, and we're both happy with any green technology that works. But the point you made was about the footprint, the actual area footprint of nuclear compared to other technologies. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. If we were living in the States where land is not an issue, we'd have a different challenge. Here, we need land for food. We absolutely need land for housing. We are not a country blessed with lots of spare land. And so when it comes to a massive rebuild of primary energy creation, we have to have an eye to just how much land we use in this. And the white paper has some modelling behind it, which talks about 120 gigs of solar. Interesting. But where are you going to put it? Because if you could clone Cleve Hill, that's at least 500 square miles that you need for that. And at the more traditional densities of solar, it's nearer 1,000 square miles. That's most of Kent. Who's going to get re-elected covering that much of the countryside with solar panels? And why does it make sense? And there's a similar issue with offshore wind too. I mean, offshore winds and solar are great technologies. But if you want to build 120 gigs of offshore wind, we have about 20-ish at the moment. That extra 100, just think about the physicality, which is always the issue with these things. So let us assume for a minute that the currently monster wind turbine that GE make, which is 14 megawatts, and where the top of the blade is about the top of the observation deck on the Empire State Building or top of the Eiffel Tower. It's a mother of a turbine. But let's assume you could stretch that to 20 megawatts. You need 5,000 of them, most of which means they're going to be going in deep water on floating platforms, which means you've got to build 200 floating platforms a year from 2025 every single year. Where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? It's the practicalities. Land use is a critical issue here because nuclear is so dense just by virtue of the energy density of the generation mechanism, the creation mechanism, that it's an effective use of space. But it's back to my earlier point about systems thinking. We have to think about the system for the new energy model for 2050. And you can't just simply take your hands off it and let things evolve, because they will not evolve fast enough. There has to be some degree of consensus about how we do this.
Yeah, thanks for that. Going back to the energy white paper, do you think the government should be more specific in the nuclear options that it puts forward? Should we be in the stage of choosing winners, given how soon the deadline will be upon us?
That's a really interesting question. Because I remember the Peter Mandelson comment about governments don't choose winners, losers choose governments. And so you do have an element of moral hazard in this. But it's not like you actually have an Amazon catalogue that you can go and pick technology from. They've gone through, some of them have gone through GDA, others have got to go through GDA. There is a sequence of choice that comes through that you have to follow. So I don't think there's any point in government saying, oh, I quite like the yellow paint on that device, or I quite like the use of alloys on that one. That's not what government should be doing. But given the pace of build that we need, you can't simply sit there and say, I want to find out which one will be absolutely the cheapest. You don't have time for that. So at the moment, and if you go back to the 2008 white paper, we talked about a fleet build of a small number of designs. That's where we still are. And it kind of doesn't matter if the EPR or the AP1000 is a bit cheaper than the other, provided they are cheap enough. Tweakiness, frankly, is irrelevant. And it's missing the point that net zero as a challenge means you don't have the opportunity to really adjust it at micrometer level. It's not stick measurement stuff. So we need a small number of big ones and a small number of little ones, just built like they're going out of style. So from a government point of view, we have, on the big scale, we have between the EPR and the AP1000s, we have enough there to start it off. If given geopolitics, the Wallong one appears as well in due course, then we can have another conversation. But short term, we need probably another one, maybe a third SMR. I'm not sure about that, but it's a smallish number. But the real issue is just cranking them out like a Nissan production line with the shortest possible heartbeat between them, and all the thinking that goes on before that in terms of sighting and so
on. Okay, that's interesting. And on that subject, do you think the timescales that the white paper sort of uses for AMR and SMR reactors are feasible?
They are plausible, but only if there's an absolute rocket behind the slot. So what we cannot do is allow this to ooze its way through in the conventional model that we've been doing for the last 15 years. It's just not fast enough. We need to learn the lessons from the vaccine challenge and response. So with AMRs, if I just come back to the big picture about primary energy, if we can't replace natural gas down gas pipes with another gas, you have an even bigger problem of how on earth do you deliver all that energy through a different route. So at the moment it looks like hydrogen is the best bet to put down the gas pipes, but you need 3 times the volume of hydrogen in terms of cubic meters that you do natural gas because of calorific value of the hydrogen. It looks like high temperature nuclear should be the cheapest way of delivering large volumes of hydrogen, but we need it ASAP, not when we get round to it. And this is where government has an inescapable obligation, which is to jolly well make sure this stuff actually happens. So the thing that's missing across the whole of Whitehall on energy, for me, is a delivery group. And BEIS itself is a great policy department, but it's not a delivery unit. It never has been, it's never had to be, because it's been about generating policy for markets to adapt. We don't have time for that. We have to find some way of either turning BEIS into a delivery unit, or probably more likely creating a delivery unit from scratch, which is focused on projects and project delivery and people who understand that running projects is not the same as running a day-to-day operational process.
Great, Tim. I think we've run out of time now, but thank you very much for giving up your time to chat to us, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Ian, thank you very much. Thank you for the therapy, and I look forward to another conversation.